All right, and I will share screen. Cool. We will get started then. So, thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Thomas Metzger, and for my project, I wanted to look at the impacts of music streaming, just like across the music industry. Um, just a quick background on my project. So I originally wanted this project to be like a video documentary. If you've ever seen like a Vox video on YouTube, I think that was kind of like the bar that I wanted to shoot for. But due to unforeseen circumstances and COVID related reasons, I decided to switch my format to a podcast. And it ended up as a 3 podcast series called the Tommy Metz Music Podcast. And there are also accompanying blogs for every podcast. And I just think that this is a better representation kind of my time and work at Boise State, whether it's through student media, like being a University Pulse DJ or like a student reporter at the Arbiter, with some audio production that I really like audio production, so that's kind of incorporates that too. It also combines my love of music and history with some academic research. So without further ado, we'll get into the first episode of the Tommy Metz Music Podcast. We'll start all the way back in 1982 we have Mr. Karl-Heinz Brandenburg. He was the original conceptor of the MP3 file. And it was originally conceived by him and his thesis advisor at his university in 1982. And basically they wanted to just create a faster way to like transfer audio files and online. And keep in mind this is like the 80s. We don't have like super fast internet yet. But I'm going to read this quote from Brandenburg about the process. Quote, "My thesis advisor for my PhD work thought of what to do with digital phone lines and composed and submitted a patent application that ISDN digital phone lines should be used to transmit music. And the patent examiner told him, 'This is impossible. We can't patent impossible things.'" That didn't stop Brandenburg. He created the Moving Pictures Experts Group, which just called for more standards of like audio encoding to be in place. And finally, in 1992, 10 years after their initial process started, they finally, created the MP3 file. And as the internet started to rise in popularity and become more accessible in the 90s, the MP3 would become like the standard file format for audio online. And excuse me. And just a few years later, the market would be flooded with MP3 players of all various shapes and sizes. Fast forward to 1999, and we get to the invention of Napster by college students Sean Fanning and Sean Parker. Napster is one of the first of these what were called peer-to-peer sharing sites where users could share audio files online with each other. And now instead of having to go to like a record store and pay $15-20 for a CD or a vinyl, you could just completely bypass the purchase process and just download music online. And while it was a slow and tedious process, because again, like the internet wasn't super fast by this point, sometimes it would take hours just to download like a single song. But regardless of this, Napster grew in popularity. By just a year later, they had over 20 million users. And this is an interesting fact I didn't know about, but at the height of its popularity, Napster had over 80 million users on the site, which is a crazy amount of music being pirated. Understandably, the music industry, artists and labels were not super into this, not super into people illegally downloading their music for free and not paying for it. And then that's where we get a bunch of lawsuits, most famously the Metallica versus Napster case. And I'm just going to read a quote real quick from Lars Ulrich, the drummer for Metallica. And this is from the Senate hearing on Napster. Quote, with Napster, every song by every artist is available for download at no cost. And of course, with no payment to the artist, the songwriter, or the copyright holder. In fact, in a 48-hour period where we monitored Napster, over 300,000 users made 1.4 million free downloads of Metallica's music. Napster hijacked our music without asking. They never sought our permission. Our catalog of music simply became available for free downloads on the Napster system. It was the band actually found out about Napster because they apparently, like, one of their songs from like a new album had leaked like through Napster, and they heard it like on the radio before it was even released. And so that kind of turned them on, and that kind of like exposed them to Napster. Many other lawsuits followed from like Dr. Dre, the Recording Industry Association of America. But many fans, I think, around this time felt differently about Napster. I think their thought process was more like, again, why should I have to pay $15-20 for, excuse me, $15-20 for an album when I only like one or two songs from it, you know? And I think it's that kind of mindset that helps like Napster users kind of feel better about their choices, their decision to use the site. And by 2001, Napster was ultimately shut down after many lawsuits, but that kind of opened a Pandora's box and allowed other peer-to-peer sharing sites would pop up in its place. Like I have a LimeWire up here. And ultimately that would just like take Napster's place. So ultimately these sites didn't really go away, but it just kind of opened that Pandora's box. Meanwhile, over at Apple, Steve Jobs was cooking up something that would ultimately like change the industry. Back in the late 90s, him and Apple were came up with this, what was called the digital hub strategy. And that's basically where you have like a Mac computer that's just like the center of your lifestyle, you know, so it keeps all your pictures, your movies, you do all your work on it. It's basically just your lifestyle centered around a Mac. And at this point, they were just missing like a music player to go with it. So around 2000, Apple had bought a company called SoundJam that was kind of like, it was like a music library app, like computer website. And that would ultimately morph into iTunes. And iTunes would ultimately be announced in January 2001. Apple's next plan was to come up with a compatible player. So they hired Tony Fadell to help design the iPod, the basic first generation iPod that you may be familiar with. Pretty sure he was only like 28 or 29 at the time when he concepted the design. And it was such a top secret project at Apple that like barely anybody knew about it. And they even had like code names for it, which included P68 or Dulcimer. I thought that was a pretty interesting fact. Phil Schiller ended up designing the famous scroll wheel in place of a keyboard. So then they invented the iPod. Now they just had to, so they invented the iPod. It was released in October 2001. Now they just had to reach out to the major labels to get the music onto iTunes. So Steve Jobs reached out to like Universal, Sony, Warner Brothers, all the big like major music company players at the time to license music to Apple. And when those songs eventually made it onto iTunes, they were all 99 cents a piece. And this was a big sticking point for Steve Jobs. He thought it was like the 99 cents per song was catchy and it'll, grab people's attention. But the problem is, according to their deal with the big labels, Apple would get 22 cents out of every 99-cent song, leaving just 67 cents to divide up amongst like labels and artists and like publishers. And that I think is kind of like a foreshadowing into what we'll see when we get to streaming services. Nonetheless, iTunes and the iPod were a massive success. It just created a very like easy and great like experience for the user. Huge libraries that can be organized very easily. By 2008, iTunes had become the largest online retailer of music. They had sold more than 4 billion songs worldwide. They were ranked as the #1 music retailer in the US. And they had sold, by this point, tens of millions of iPods in various like shapes and designs and generations. Excuse me. That ultimately leads us to the second podcast, which is our introduction to streaming services. And I'm just going to make a little disclaimer before I move on. For my project, I largely just focused on Spotify because they are arguably around this time, especially like, or like they're largely just like the biggest like streaming site, arguably, and I'll show you some stats. But every like all the features that like Spotify has, as well as kind of like the downsides of Spotify, can also be applied to other like streaming sites like Apple Music, Tidal, YouTube, Deezer, etc. But just for the purpose of my project, I'm just largely focusing on Spotify. Um, Spotify was founded in 2006 by Daniel Ek and Martin Lorentzen, and they would launch 2 years later in 2008. The site was largely created in response to like overwhelming piracy. You know, like still some of these sites were like still kind of popular around this time. Here's a quote from Daniel Ek on just why they created Spotify. The only way to solve the problem was to create a service that was better than piracy and at the same time compensates the music industry. And kind of looking back on it now in 2020, I think that quote's a little funny, and we'll get into that. Some key Spotify statistics real quick. 286 million monthly active users. Over 130 million of them are premium subscribers. There are about 50 million tracks available on Spotify. 44% of users use it on a daily basis. So you can see that Spotify is clearly very popular amongst music consumers. And kind of, you know, just like at the time of creation, all there was like iTunes, you know, kind of like iTunes or like Pandora and YouTube were kind of like the only music like sites that you can listen to music on. But while these sites are like extremely convenient for consumers and users of the product, it ultimately comes at the expense at the artists. And the main criticism from these streaming sites is the microscopic payout rates that they give. I've got some numbers. This is kind of a little bit of a rough estimate, but it kind of shows you how many like streams it takes to earn $1 roughly on these sites. So Spotify, about 229 streams. YouTube, nearly 1,500 streams just to earn $1. Apple Music, 136 streams. So you can clearly see that these sites don't pay a lot of money per stream. And I kind of have like a little example of kind of the flow chart of a payout rate. So you have your Spotify monthly revenue. That's just like how much money they make, you know. And then they use what is called a pro rata system, where you take the artist streams divided by the total number of streams on the website, and then you get that number. That's the amount of like money. That's the amount of money before it gets paid out. A good chunk of it will go to, you know, the master and publishing rights, the record label, and it ultimately just leaves very little for the artists that ultimately are creating this content. I have a little chart right here. I think this kind of well shows the kind of the way that like the amount of users that each site has, and also linking it to like how much their paying rate. I know Napster is up here in the corner, but I'm pretty sure that this like Napster was rebranded as like a streaming site, and I'm pretty sure it's like different. It's way different now than when I talked about it earlier, when it was just like, you know, people illegally downloading music. Um, but as you can see, Napster doesn't have a whole lot of users right now, but they arguably pay the most out of all these sites, which I think is kind of ironic. You can see Spotify down here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but they're all the way down here with a super low payout rate, but they're like the second highest streaming site behind YouTube. I think this middle column over here is the kind of the stat to look at. It's the minimum number of plays, or it's the number of plays needed to earn just a minimum wage, which I don't know like what the hourly rate is for that, but they do have like a figure number right there. 366,000 streams on Spotify just to earn minimum wage. 2 million streams on YouTube just to earn minimum wage. You get the idea. These artists don't get paid a lot through these sites, which leads to oh yeah, there's also other factors that can contribute to a payout rate, whether you know where the listener, what country they're in, um, whether they're like a paid subscriber or they have like a just like a free account. Royalty rates usually decided by the labels. Excuse me. Ultimately, that leads us to the Justice at Spotify petition, which is just recently kind of started taking off. It was created by the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers. And this is just like, you know, musicians, producers, DJs, like road crews, like roadies. Over 25,000 artists have signed the petition, and it's just kind of like them fighting back against Spotify and their unfair, like some of their unfair factors. Some of their demands include like a user-centric payment model, elimination of any pre-existing payola. Their big sticking point is to pay at least 1 cent per stream. I have this quote from Daniel Ek, just kind of about like what he believes artists need to be doing to actually make money off streaming. Quote, in an interview with Music Ally, Spotify's billionaire CEO Daniel Ek informed artists that in the streaming age, you can't record music once every 3 to 4 years and think that's going to be enough. The artists today that are making it realize that it's about creating a continuous engagement with their fans. It is about putting the work in, about the storytelling around the album, and about keeping a continuous dialogue with your fans. Now, while I do agree that it is important, obviously, for artists to keep their audience's attention and putting out content, I do think this quote is a little hypercritical, considering how we've seen how, you know, these sites pay out these artists. And I think just like it's kind of victim blaming the artists a little bit. Clearly, like if you're a big artist like Beyonce or Taylor Swift, you know, you can probably afford to put, you know, one album out every like couple of years, you know, because you'll ultimately like garner like millions of streams probably off those sites. But for smaller independent artists, that probably might not be the case. They're probably, you know, they're not being sustained by these sites, and so they have to also like put their energy into like merch sales, like touring whenever live shows come back, and like they could be also like writing new material. So I think like, you know, constantly having to put out music to just like engage their audience is kind of like, you know, it's kind of hypercritical. Anyway, some other problems with these sites is like the oversaturation, meaning like in this case, like there's just, you know, like I said earlier, there's over 50 million tracks on Spotify. Tons of artists are on these sites. Um, one, according to my research, back in 2019, it was estimated 40,000 songs were uploaded to Spotify each day, which, if you're like a small indie artist, just like making music out of your bedroom, these sites can be good for like getting your music out there, but the problem isn't getting it out there. It's like, grabbing that audience's attention and kind of like standing out in this sea of content. Um, I think because of this, we started seeing a rise in more independently run labels. And when I say independently, the way I'm kind of defining it is, like a small crew, maybe like 1, 2 people, up to like just like a small crew of people, like independent, like running a record label. And I think as opposed to like bigger labels, like Universal or Sony, who might like be casting a wide net to try to reach as many people as possible. These indie labels just like don't. Most of them like don't have that huge reach. So I think what we're seeing is that they're more catering to like niche genres. We're seeing like labels that specify just in like indie rap or indie pop, uh rock, like garage rock, whatever, like. And I think that's helping them like attract an audience by just trying to like kind of focus on that like specific demographic. um and it's also like caused a band like Arcade Fire, who in the early 2000s they were like one of the like critical acclaimed indie darlings, because of this like oversaturation and all this content that's being put out. They ultimately like signed to Universal, I believe, like just to like for the distribution factor, just to like get their music in all these different places. um Another aspect that has recently just kind of developed is Spotify's discovery mode, which many people are calling the new payola. Payola, if you don't know, means like pay to play. And basically, Spotify offered this discovery mode where, in exchange for an even smaller payout rate, the promotional rate, they can get like kind of a bump in promotion, which, like, maybe they have a better chance of like getting onto a big playlist or whatever, or like just reaching more people, I guess. But I think like this kind of harkens back to like radio in the 50s, where artists would like pay radio stations and like DJs to play their music. And it's just like, it's a pay it many see it as like a pay to play, and for those that maybe can't afford to participate in this discovery mode, they're just, they can be left to, kind of just swim in this sea of content. Ultimately, and with like, the amount of music and content on these sites, like, don't really know how effective like this bump in promotion can be for an even smaller payout rate. I'm going to end this episode of the podcast with this quote from a Pitchfork article by Mark Hogan. This is a quote from George Howard, who's a music business professor at Berklee College of Music. It's meet the new boss, same as the old boss, he tells me, drawing a parallel to radio. There's certainly a defensible thesis that Spotify is the new kingmaker, and if they choose to make your career, they can, which I certainly agree. That leads us to the third episode of the podcast, which talks about physical music sales. And for this podcast, I kind of just wanted to ask the question of like, how has this rise in streaming affected the sales of like physical music, like vinyl and CDs? Excuse me real quick. And despite streaming's rise in popularity over the last decade, we've seen actually vinyl record sales grow. In fact, many say that they're having a comeback. while CD sales have actually dropped significantly. I have some charts here that kind of just show you the way that, like, you know, since 2006 is when many people say like the vinyl comeback began, and since then it's just, you know, grown in popularity. Um, while CDs, while they kind of had their heyday like in the 90s and the 2000s, ultimately, like, since you can kind of see like since the conception and invention of like iTunes, you can kind of see it start to drop. And then once you hit like 2008, 2009, when Spotify started coming around, you see it just like dramatically drop off. Um, since 2006, like I said, vinyl records have made a comeback. In fact, in 2019, 18.8 million vinyl LPs were sold in the United States, up 14% compared to 2018, and more than 20-fold since 2006. Also, according to Nielsen's 2019 music or year-end music report, vinyl LPs accounted for 17% of album sales in the United States. So then that made me ask, like, well, what is the reason for this resurgence in vinyl? And so I kind of asked around, like, on the internet, you know, on like Reddit and like Facebook groups. I made a little survey and just kind of asked people like why they think like vinyl in particular are kind of rising back in popularity. I think one main reason that I didn't list here, but it could be also that just like, you know, more people are listening to more music. You know, there's hundreds of millions of active users on these sites listening to music every day, which if they're like, you know, into vinyl collecting, they can go out and buy their favorite albums. But I have 5 reasons listed here as kind of like the main reasons that I've noticed why people collect and buy vinyl. First one is tangibility. There's people just like collecting things that have like value and meaning to them, whether it's like, you know, baseball cards, football trading cards, or, you know, in this case, vinyl music. There's a feeling of ownership when you know, own like your favorite music in a physical format. Somebody said it's a material way of like showing love and appreciation. Second reason is the sound, bro. Many argue that like vinyl records like sound better. They have like an analog kind of sound as opposed to like a digital like file on like a CD or a streaming site. Kind of want to put a little asterisk above that because I think listening to, you know, putting a record on a player and like listening to an album all the way through is certainly different than like if you're streaming on like a playlist or something. Because when you're like, when you put an album on, you're probably going to be more like focused on it and more like attentive to the music, which, you know, could ultimately make it sound better. Does, you know, do I think vinyl sounds better? Like, I think like some albums certainly do sound really good on vinyl, but I think it's also mainly due to that like listening experience. Uh, Number 3, many cite like going to just like a record store as like, you know, just one of their favorite parts of buying vinyl, you know, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too. Collectability, there's tons of different like colored vinyl, cool artwork. I have a couple here that I kind of just want to show you. Probably, hopefully, won't take too long. Usually, like I have a picture here of a clear vinyl, but usually when you think of like a vinyl record, you think of like, you know, a black record, but they actually like come in various. They can come in various colors and designs. So like I have this one. This is like a butterfly press from a Japanese band called Kikagaku Moyo. I have this one from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Australian psych rock band. They're really not well known. Their label's well known for like these crazy pressings, got like a splatter kind of wax. And so yeah, so there's just, you know, all different like kinds of vinyl up to like the artists that people just like to collect. Um, Finally, number 5, people just like buying music because it like supports their favorite artists. It's just a great way to support artists with the little payouts that they get from these streaming sites. And sorry, I have hair in my mouth. That leads us to record stores, which I talk a little more about like in my blog post. Um, According to my research, there are about 2,600 record stores in the United States. About 40 of them make up what is known as SIMS, not the video game, but the Coalition of Independent Music Stores. And this is just like a group of about like 40 indie record store owners. They got together back in 1995 and just started this, you know, this little group of just like these independent record store owners. Included in SIMS is the local record store here in Boise, Idaho, the Record Exchange. And SIMS, they're responsible for events like Record Store Day, which is usually one day a year where it's just like a day to like celebrate these, you know, independent record stores, basically. Artists will like release special editions of albums and vinyl, and people, you know, they're like limited edition just to this like one day. And like I said, it's just kind of a way to like show love and appreciation and celebrate these indie stores. In my blog, I also discuss kind of the importance of these stores to like many musicians. You know, if you just do like a quick Google search, you can find countless quotes of musicians who say how important these like record stores are to them and like how they've helped like develop kind of their music tastes. I'm gonna read just like a quick quote from Chris Novoselic, who is the former bass player of grunge band Nirvana, and it kind of describes his experience of first like walking into his local record store. I bought my first record in a shop with wooden walls with that smell of incense. It was a compilation called Hey Jude by the Beatles that had 10 tracks on it. And now he talks a little more just like about how important like that trip ultimately like would be for him and his like development as a musician. So clearly these record stores mean a lot to a lot of people. And that's the end of the third podcast. So just to kind of wrap things up, I talked about how the rise of like Napster and peer-to-peer sites ultimately led us to these streaming sites that many of us use today. I think like a lot of, especially like younger users maybe are not like aware kind of how we got to where we are today. And I think it's important to kind of look back a little bit and see kind of what led up to us having to millions of people using these sites. Overall, they were like a response to growing music piracy. And while these streaming sites provide accessibility and are really fantastic listening experience for the consumer, it ultimately comes at the expense of the artists on these sites, whether it's through very, very small payouts, or just oversaturation, just kind of like swimming in the sea of content, trying to stand out. We've seen artists kind of push back against these sites like Spotify with the Justice at Spotify petition, kind of helping spark that conversation around what is like a fair pay rate for these artists. And despite streaming's rising popularity in like the last 10 years, we've also seen vinyl records make a comeback. And again, maybe that's attributed to more people listening to more music than ever before. People may, just like collecting vinyl. And so, yes, that is my presentation. Thank you for listening. Here are my references. And yeah, I'll open the floor to questions.
I've got one real quick. Nice. First off, awesome job. I think the topic's super interesting, and I'd love to learn more about it. I'm for sure going to listen to all 3 of the episodes. But the first one I have is, if Spotify like were to raise it up to like 1 cent, like they're asking for, do you think that model where they'll continue to get paid for every so many listens?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that's sustainable? Because the way I see it is that's even better than like physical music sales, because physical music sales, you buy it once, you listen to it forever, but you only get paid for the one time.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas like if I come back and listen to the song like 100 times, throughout the next couple of weeks and continue that over time, do you think that's more of a beneficial model?
I think like I definitely think like raising like the payout rate like for streaming would definitely probably encourage more people to like actually listen to the music, like obviously like people already listen to the music, but they just like don't pay the artists enough. I think like it kind of can go like hand in hand to where like if more people are listening to it like on like a streaming site, then they could also go out and like buy a physical copy of that. Like you said, like it is different because like you buy that once and you're only paying that once. But I think like if you like take into account like how many times like people are listening on these sites, like it could definitely like rack up a good like chunk of money, I think. And then that could ultimately like lead them to support artists in like other ways too, whether it be like buying a ticket to like a show or buying their merch. So I think it definitely can kind of go like hand in hand.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
I'll go.
Okay.
So first off, check your portfolio, and it looks really amazing. I like it a
Thank
lot.
you. Thank you so much.
And also, check your Spotify account. My Strange Addiction is my favorite song.
What is it?
My Strange Addiction is my favorite song.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For those of you that don't know, I make music and it's on Spotify, and I have a
Yeah, I checked that.
Billie Eilish cover on Spotify.
Yeah. It's really cool.
Thank you so much.
So I love how you made your seminar project connected to what you are really passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
And so here is my question.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, do you think the risk? Oh, I mean, like, do you think the discovery mode for the Spotify, is it worth the risk for new independent artists to do that?
I kind of have like mixed feelings about the discovery mode, because like the way I see it is that like like I said, there are like millions and millions of tracks on Spotify, millions of artists, thousands of artists probably, and like even though like they already don't like get paid a whole lot just through like their regular like model, I think the discovery mode ultimately like probably doesn't like do a whole lot for like these smaller independent artists, just because like I don't like it's such like a recent, I think they just like announced it like a month ago or something, and so I don't know like
Okay.
I don't know like how many artists are like using it or like how effective it is, but from my understanding, um just with the like amount of content and stuff on these sites, like it doesn't seem to me to be worth it, for a smaller payout rate to unless your song ends up on like every single major playlist, kind of like if any of you remember when like kind of Drake like took over Spotify for like that week or whatever.
Yeah.
Unless it was something kind of like that dramatic, I don't think like the promotional rate is like worth it for many smaller artists.
All right.
Yeah.
Another question is, so right now, streaming platforms are really in demand, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what would you think the future of music might be?
I think like um I think the future, like, I think a bunch of these sites, like, obviously they're very like convenient and accessible for, many users. It's very like easy to use. So I don't think like these streaming sites will like necessarily go away, or like,
Right.
it's hard for me to see like, a dramatic shift in the way people like listen to music than
Mhm.
what we're already doing, because it seems like, these sites are very, compatible with like, they're very compatible with the internet, like
Yeah.
most things are, but I think just like right now the main conversation is, how do we like, how do these sites like pay these artists fairly, and are able, how are these artists, going to be able to like sustainably create music, because of like these small payout rates, like you see like artists like will have to go to like other avenues to make money, whether it's like,
Mhm.
merch sales or touring, but obviously because of COVID, like they can't go out and tour, which is obviously a huge loss of revenue. um and so yeah, I think like it's hard for me to kind of picture like a more convenient like listening experience for the consumer, but like they can definitely, I think the next conversation point is just like paying the artist fairly. Yeah,
Cool.
thank you so
Right.
much.
That's all my questions.
Cool, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Okay.
Not totally sure how I want to word this, but with COVID and like the lack of tourism, we've seen like a huge shift in like funding for small independent venues.
Hmm.
Um, for me, when I go to concerts, a lot of the times I've seen opening acts and it's encouraged me to go discover them further.
Hmm.
So like, I guess I'm curious with the discovery tab as well. If you're a small indie artist, like what do you think their best shot is at trying to get new engagement, especially with COVID and no touring?
It's a good question. I mean, I've seen like artists kind of shift, like you've seen a lot of artists do like live stream performances, which like, obviously like probably don't pay as much as if you're like playing like in person in a club. But like, so we've seen that. I think like, for like I kind of mentioned like the indie labels, like, and how they kind of like will appeal more to like a niche genre than try to cast like a big net. So I've seen like I talked to, um, one label I talked to is Citrus City label, and I kind of talk about it in my podcast too. And they're from like New York. It was just like a couple college students like starting indie music label, and they like, kind of like focus more like, he told me that like he tends to focus more like on the distribution aspect, and like giving these artists like a platform, a platform like to put their music out. I think it's definitely harder if you're just like, like for me, I'm just like a guy making music like in his bedroom. I'm not like signed to like in a label or anything. From my experience, it's mainly just like, continuously like reminding people that you're there. Think it could definitely be different and more helpful like if you're signed to like a label that can like, promote you further than you can like promote yourself. um but that answer your question?
Yeah, sorry, that was kind of a bizarre question.
No, it's okay.
Um,
I could
and then
talk about it for hours.
and then sort of to further that, where do you think SoundCloud comes into the mix? I feel like it used to be super big and then has sort of taken a down step
I
recently.
think like, um I think SoundCloud for many people is like you're right. Like I think it definitely used to be like more popular than it is now. But I think like for SoundCloud, I think it's mainly for people to just kind of like get their like stuff up and on the internet. Because like another thing I talked about with Manny, who runs Citrus City, is that there's just like there's such a demand for like these, not everybody has like a record player or a CD player or something like that. And so like there's just such a demand for these artists to like be on these sites that like if you're not on these sites, then like how are people gonna listen unless you're just like on the street corner selling cassettes and stuff every day. But I think for SoundCloud, it's mainly more just like about getting the content up as opposed to like, because I can't like remember like how much, if any, if at all, if they like pay the artists, but I think it's more just about like kind of getting that content up there and making it like accessible to listeners.
Yeah. And then lastly, I was just curious what a few of your favorite artists were.
A few of my favorite artists, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. I love King Gizzard if you guys know about them. I'm really I don't want to try and sound like an elitist and say that I only listen to like independent artists, but like I'm looking at my vinyl right now and I just have like like I like Pink Floyd. They're not like an indie band, but Flaming Lips, Radiohead, King Gizzard, Tame Impala. Yeah, I'll go with those for now.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, great job. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, your presentation, you killed it. And also you do have very good music. And then kind of adding on to that, as an artist yourself, do you think that Spotify's ability to kind of give people an audience or a platform to build off of, do you think for some people that could be worth the very low pay that you get out of it?
I think like that's a good question. I think like for many like smaller artists like myself, that like I say, I just like make music in a bedroom and I just like upload it. Like I think it's more kind of like what I said about SoundCloud. It's more like for smaller artists, I think it's more about just like getting their music like out on these platforms that people are on. There's like a bunch of sites that you can, like the site I use to get like my music on sites is called DistroKid, and it's like a third party distributor basically. So like I pay like $19 a year or something like that, and I can upload like as many tracks to this site, and then they put it on like iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, all that stuff like for me basically. And so I think like that's definitely like an option for like smaller artists just to get their music like out there. But I don't think like well, it would be nice to like make, tons of money off your songs and streaming and stuff. I think like for many smaller artists, they're not like necessarily worried about that. Like when they're first starting off, they're just kind of more worried about like, attracting that audience. And, if the consumers are like in the, Spotify and these sites have like millions of users, that's just like where you want to be. You just want to like put your stuff in front of as many eyes as you can.
Along those lines, what is the overhead for companies like Spotify, et cetera? Why are they, sorry if you can't hear me, why are they paying them so low?
They,
I mean, this just doesn't seem like there's, like how much overhead is there that they have to pay that low? Or they're just doing that to gouge people?
Like one stat I looked up, or that I found that I omitted from my presentation, was that like there's like an like streaming brings in like tons and tons of money, you know,
Yeah.
because there's just like millions of users. I think like in like 2018 or 2019, like these sites made like over $9 billion
Right.
from these sites. And so clearly they like, you know, they clearly have the money to like, but like, or I think they made like $18 billion or something like that. And only like 9 billion, 8 billion of that is like actually paid to artists. And like, that sounds like a lot, but then when you just like think of like all, like I said, like these, like all of these artists, all of these tracks on Spotify, you know, it's just like the way, and I kind of mentioned they have like a pro rata system, which is just like a form of like how they divide like the streams. I'll see if I can find it real quick. It says pro rata is where the compensation of, so basically they divide the number of like streams on like a track divided by like all the users on the site, you know, as opposed to like a user-centric model, which is more like, which is basically the same thing, but like, as opposed to dividing it by like, I think like every single user on the site, it's more just like it's divided amongst like the amount of like listeners that you have, you know. So as opposed to like if an artist like Kendrick Lamar has like 54 million monthly listeners, you know, which is a lot, and like brings a lot to like to his music and a lot of streams. But like when you divide that, like his total number of streams by like, you know, 280 million users, like it's gonna just drop that payout rate. And then there's also, you know, like I mentioned, like, you know, a specific label might have like a specific royalty rate like for an artist. So it's like sometimes it's ultimately like it's just like not there's like the artists mostly have like no say, you know, how they're getting paid, which I think is like, you know, the point of like the Justice at Spotify petition, where, you know, they're just trying to spark that conversation. It's like, hey, like we're, you know, not getting paid enough. I had that chart that showed, you know, how many streams it takes to earn just like a minimum wage. And
I was trying to think if they just had a valid reason why they're not paying that much, or just greed.
I think it's mostly just greed, and like, especially like when you read that quote that I took from the Spotify CEO, you know, where you're just like, oh, you guys just got to put out more music, and then you'll get more streams. It's like, well, it's not like that easy for artists just to like, you know, write and record an album in a day. You know, there's all these other aspects that go into like, you know, making like music and promoting it that costs money, you know. So
I have to get to my next presentation, but I really enjoyed your topic. I look forward to delving into it further through your project. So
awesome. Thank you guys so much for listening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.